Hi, this is Christy Brooks, and thank you for listening to my podcast, Subjective Realities. Today we're going to be taking a look at Bram Stoker's Dracula. One of the things I like to look at when considering this story is the time period in which it was written. 1897, Britain, is a time period of upheaval and change and vast economic disparities. You have the haves and the have-nots. And Bram Stoker would have been more in the haves section. However, even for the haves, it would have been a rough time. You're looking at a time right before the transition into automobiles and airplanes, right before a lot of the changes that were coming, before any world wars. Also, Britain was imperialist at the time, which means they had places like India and Jamaica under control and had not relinquished their hold on the government yet. So a white upper middle class person like Bram Stoker would have felt very much in control of his life for most things. But since it was the height of the Industrial Revolution, before any kind of environmental safeties had been put into place, you had very much companies dumping pollution into the rivers that they drank from. The River Thames is talked about in a lot of the literature of the time as being so horribly stenchy that people, could not bear to even be around it. And yet this is the water that they had to use to bathe, to drink. And so they, even though they are above the fray, they are very much still live in a world where they can see the bad stuff and they have to be around the bad stuff. So it affected him, not as much as the poor people, or women, but it affected him enough that it created a dystopian version of the world, and he used that and parlayed it into his mythos of the vampire. And Bram Stoker's Dracula is considered the foundational written mythos of the vampire. It had been around before that in legends and lore, but he solidified it into writing, and from there on out, it is what we look to for the vampire mythology. These are all things to keep in mind when considering the book. Something else that I always look at when considering the book is the role of women in the society in 1897 Britain. They had not yet been granted the right to vote, so the women's suffrage movement is starting to gain traction during this time. People who lived in Britain would have begun to see women dressed in white out protesting. They would have considered it something that could cause damage to the very foundations of their home life if women had more rights. That was also a disruption that was happening that would have affected Bram Stoker. I say this because probably on my second reading through the book, I noticed something, and it stuck with me for years. At the end of the story, after Mina has been bitten by Dracula, they are hunting him with his psychic connection to Mina. And this is important to me because Jonathan Harker, Mina's beloved, has also been bitten by women vampires when he was first held hostage in Dracula's estate. But they don't hold the same kind of psychic connection or power over him that Dracula does over Mina. So I began to wonder, is this because he's saying that Dracula is the only one that can do it? I mean, there's not a wide base of vampires to look at and try to decide that in the story. There's very limited amount of information on that. Or is it more possible that Bram Stoker never even considered the fact that a woman vampire could have dominion over a human male? Were the men so much higher than the women in his mind that a female vampire would not have any dominion there, that they would not have any power there? The same way that Dracula was able to take over Mina with a bite would leave Jonathan Harker completely immune. And what does it say that Dracula never bit Harker, that he only allowed the women to feed on him? I'm not sure. That's something to consider, though. However, I do think that when you look at the time period, probably to Bram Stoker, it never even occurred to him that a woman would have enough power over a man, even a vampire woman, to take psychic control over him, or to have a psychic connection, or to have any input or authority into his train of thought. And that is something important to consider, because it very clearly affects the book and the narrative, that only the women have that kind of oppressive psychic power over them. Another thing to consider is that the book is written in a very interesting way. It's called an epistolary format, or I think I'm saying that right, pronouncing it right anyway. So instead of having a point of view like omniscient, first person, second person, you have an epistolary format where it's a lot of written letters, notes. You wouldn't know this if you'd never read the book, if you'd only seen the movies, but notes from Jonathan Harker to Mina, notes from Mina to Jonathan Harker. Then you have journal entries by Van Helsing, things like that. It's not actually told in a straight story format, which makes it easier to get a glimpse of what he feels the characters are saying. So in that view, we can very clearly see the subjugation of how the women are looked at and how he thinks their point of references and their mental states are. And if you go back and read it, you can see this too. Something else to consider is the fact that Bram Stoker clearly wrote the mythos so that Dracula has to be killed with a stake, a wooden stake through the heart. It's stated multiple times. However, at the end, Dracula is not killed with a wooden stake. He's killed with a Bowie knife. Van Helsing stabs him with a Bowie knife. So is he dead or is he not? Like, to me, that's an open-ended question. Because even though the psychic link appears to be gone, things go back to normal, he was not killed the way the mythos was written. And if I'm an author and I write out very firm rules to my vampires and how they have to die, and then I do not follow those rules when I kill my vampire, that causes a disconnect. And I don't think it was something accidentally done. Bram Stoker seems to be very intentional with how he does things, and it's very much written out and methodically thought out. So to me, it's an indicator that he didn't really want the vampire to die, that he wanted the story to continue and go on. And I like that idea. I like the idea of leaving it open-ended but not, so that if people choose to end the story there, it ends there. And if they choose to look at it further, it can go on further. Because for me, the real question becomes, what happens after Mina and Jonathan Harker die? They both were bitten by vampires. They both were on the brink of transitioning into vampires, but they didn't. And so when they die, do they die a normal death? Do they become vampires? If Dracula didn't really die, it leaves that very open-ended, and you could take from that what you want and build on it. And the fact that no one ever has is kind of surprising to me. After all, Dracula is one of the most recreated, adapted stories out there. People have taken it and built on the mythos. They have changed the mythos. I mean, in Bram Stoker's Dracula, he could walk around in the daylight. The sunlight did not burn him. It was actually just dampening to his powers. He didn't have full use of his psychic abilities, and he didn't have his full range of powers, but he could in fact walk around in the daylight. So the change that came about with them being creatures of the night was later on, and it was an adaptation to the mythos. It was essentially a fan fiction that changed that very foundational view of Dracula and of other vampires that came after. And that's why fan fiction can actually be an important piece to understanding literature as well. And I don't want to hear any bad things about fan fiction, because in fact, almost all of our stories are built on the foundations of other stories. And that is how humans do. The entire Renaissance period is in fact fan fiction to the Bible and to religious mythos. And in fact, Bram Stoker himself did not come up with the idea for the vampire or for Dracula out of thin air. He solidified many different mythos. The lore of the vampire had been around in Romania and Transylvania for a while, but Bram Stoker actually seemed to base it off of two very real historical figures, The first one is very well known because it was Vlad the Impaler, also known as Vlad Dracula, which is where he got the name and what he based a lot of the mythos on. Now, Vlad the Impaler got his name because he was a historical ruler in Romania that used the impaling method to conquer his enemies. And actually, it's interesting because he's a hero in Romania. He used his power to solidify the country and to bring about his force of rule through, pain and through this idea of brute force. And if you don't do what you want, I will impale you and you will bow to me and my countrymen. So even though he was a very bad man, a lot of people in Romania still revere him as a hero. This seems in conflict to us, but when we look back at history, it's common too. There's a lot of people that we would consider bad people who did bad things, who then took on the mythos of the hero later on. I don't know why, but that is the case for Vlad Dracula. He was born and lived around 1448, and that is the primary figure for Dracula. I mean, there's obviously a lot of blood involved in impaling and things like that, but the myth of drinking the blood to remain young actually starts with a countess, Elizabeth Bathory, who, by all accounts, racked up the highest body count of any serial killer in history in the 600 to 650 range. She was known for taking women in the neighboring villages. She preferred virgins and bringing them in. Since she was a countess, she had a palace. She would tell people that they were going to be educated or trained. So young children, usually around the age of 13, 14, when they would start to look for apprenticeships in that time, would go to her castle and she would kill them. And then she would drink their blood and bathe in it because she thought it kept her young. And so the idea of blood being a youthful thing was tied into her and how she killed these women and drank and bathed in their blood to stay young. She lived in Hungary around the 1560s to 1600s. I believe she was convicted in early 1610 and eventually died in 1614. It's interesting because even though, by all accounts, she did most of the killing and she would order her handmaids to do the killing, the handmaids actually got found guilty of the murders and she was bricked up and isolated and left alive because of her family's power and influence. So that's something that is, I can't imagine being a handmaiden to her and being faced with the choice of kill these women or I will slit your throat myself, or, and then when you got discovered and you're saying, hey, this very powerful woman made me kill these people, and they're like, yeah, you had the choice not to. Like, not really. If I said no, she would just kill me and drink my blood. Such is the poor person's dilemma throughout most of history. Anyway, those are the two figures that he added into the mythos and then built it all together to solidify Dracula. So now you know that bit of history. Okay, I hope you found a lot of interesting things to think about. I hope this gave you some new perspectives, something to consider at least, and that you enjoyed it. Next week, I want to go over Jane Eyre because I did a YouTube video on it, but I'm going to pull this into the podcast so that I have it in this series as well because it's one of my favorites. Thank you for listening. Bye.